Bienvenidos to the Bronze Titan podcast on YouTube. I'm your host, Benjamin Ramos. I'm an independent journalist and longtime Cuba Solidarity activist based here in New York City. And from time to time, once a month maybe, I'll be bringing you a podcast from the international movement to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba. On today's segment, I'll be speaking with Bob Schwartz, the Executive Director of Global Health Partners, to get an update on the incredible campaign to raise $150,000 to purchase 150 pacemakers to be sent to Cuba. Welcome to the Bronze Titan, Bob.
Thanks for having me back again, Ben.
Wonderful. Bob, let's remind our listening audience, why did GHP start up this wonderful campaign to raise all this money?
Well, the campaign started last year. Cuba, you'll recall, has a backlog of 2,500 cardiac patients that need pacemakers. The idea was to try to alleviate some of that shortage and give Cuba a little bit of breathing room. So last year we launched a campaign. This was the second effort. It was a 3-month burst, which went June, July, and August. And we had targeted $150,000, as you said, to try to raise enough money to buy roughly 150 pacemakers. And the good news is we exceeded that goal. As of the end of last week, which is when the campaign stopped, we had raised roughly $165,000, and we've shipped, or we've purchased at least, another 165 pacemakers for Cuba.
Bob, what was the reaction to the world community around this campaign? I mean, when you say we're going to raise $150,000 from a grassroots level, I mean, that can be very daunting, especially if it's revolving around something like Cuba. So what was the response like from the community?
Well, it's surprising. It resonated tremendously, not just in the United States, but globally. Globally, we've shipped now 745 pacemakers over the course of this campaign. It includes Global Health Partners and the Saving Lives campaign coordinating in the United States, and then our partners in Europe. There are 9 countries that are raising funds to send pacemakers. So we shipped, from the United States, we shipped 395 pacemakers. The Europeans shipped 350. That's the breakout. The response is very interesting. Most people have family members, parents, grandparents, friends that have pacemakers, or they know somebody that needs a pacemaker. So it was an appeal that resonated. You know, it's rare when you have the opportunity to save somebody's life. And in this instance, we've saved 745 lives. So it's a tremendous feat. The grand scheme of things, the truth is, it's a Band-Aid for Cuba, because the situation is just so dire, particularly in the public health sector.
And why is it so dire?
Well, it's got a lot to do with U.S. foreign policy. If the intent of U.S. foreign policy in the Trump administration is to inflict more pain, more suffering, more starvation at times, and more death on Cuba's population, their policy is a raving success. The lack of hard currency, the inability to trade with normal partners in the way most countries do, has led to, at least in the public health sector, a scarcity of medicines, medical supplies, basic meds that we take for granted. It's not unusual to go into a hospital in Cuba these days and not find antibiotics or analgesics. Analgesics meaning ibuprofen, aspirin. The shortages are just that dramatic.
Wow, Bob. Just to hear, though, it is powerful to hear that the international community has come on. I mean, pacemakers are coming from Europe. What are some of the countries? What are some of the allied supporters that are coming internationally and abroad?
Well, if you're talking about for this particular campaign, it's being led by the Swiss, a group called Medical Europa, but it includes the French, the English, the Spanish, the Germans, the Italians, It's a very broad-based community appeal.
And again, those sounds like countries that at the United Nations, which should be the vote, which is coming up in a few weeks, in a few, well, yeah, within a month, few weeks, are allied countries that tend to vote that this blockade is inhumane. And many of them have the discussion when they justify their vote. They talk about the medical situation in Cuba. They talk about the lack of all those resources. Um, Bob, so the campaign ended last week. Is there going to be a second phase? Is there something else that's coming up?
Well, I'll be very honest with you, Ben. Raising funds for pacemakers is it's a very costly endeavor. As
Mm.
I indicated, we've saved 745 lives at a cost of ballpark $600,000. Uh, it's a lot of money. Now we look at Cuban priorities. We're communicating with the public health ministry on a regular basis. We're looking at all of their priorities, and we're trying to decide what can an organization. Remember, we have limited resources. What can an organization like ours do that's going to have a significant impact? And we try to isolate areas where we can help. We're not a substitute for Cuba's bilateral relationships. So the things that we identify are things where we can kind of fill a void. I'll give you some examples. Last year, we sent anesthesia machines to Cuban hospitals. The largest hospital in Havana, Calixto Garcia Hospital, has 23 operating rooms. They only had two operating anesthesia machines, if you can imagine that. So that was an area that we thought we could make a significant impact. Uh, Another example would be suture. And we're constantly weighing how to buy sufficient suture where we get a good value for the dollars we're spending, and we can make a difference there. The two things, if you're doing surgery, you need anesthesia machines and you need suture. And if you don't have one or the other, you just don't do surgery. So those are two areas that we're constantly looking at. Uh, Global Health Partners has shipped this year more than $2.5 million worth of meds and medical supplies. So the Pacemaker campaign, while it's probably one of the more visible and dramatic areas that we work in, we're dealing with an entire range of product to help sustain Cuba's public health system. I haven't seen conditions like this, Ben, in this is now 31 years that I'm working in Cuba. I haven't seen conditions like this since the beginning of the special period. And I think the conditions are probably worse today than they were during the special period.
That is terrifying to hear, Bob. Terrifying to hear that we are looking at that somehow the clock has been turned back over 3 decades in terms of the lack of resources in the Cuban medical system, a medical system that is world renowned. We're talking about Cuban doctors are some of the most well prepared, well educated doctors in the world. People, some folks don't realize. Talk to us about that, Bob. I mean, you're in this world of the medical field and all that. What are Tell us about what the preparation that Cuban doctors go through. What is Cuba so well renowned in terms of their medical health care, education, and field? Yet they're at a point where they can't do surgery because they don't have what they need.
That's exactly the problem. Medical education in Cuba is free, as is higher education in general. You can go as far as you want in terms of academic studies, as long as you have the commitment and the will. So Cuba probably turns out more doctors than any other country on a per thousand basis. Uh, they go not to make money. The system is very different than it is here. Doctors are not wealthy in Cuba. In fact, if you look at income of Cubans, doctors are probably at the low end of the totem pole in terms of how much money they make each year. But it's a very prestigious job, and the commitment is to help. Doctors go into medicine in Cuba because they want to help their population. Um, Having said that, it's challenging to be working in the healthcare field if you don't have the tools. If you don't have uh, antibiotics, you don't have suture, you don't have anesthesia machines, you don't have, at times, gloves, disposable gloves. Uh, it's very difficult to practice. And then, of course, there's the pressures of the economic pressures of surviving in Cuba. Doctors live in the peso economy. Prices have skyrocketed for basic essentials, food, gasoline, for example. Uh, and there's a tremendous pressure uh, on doctors to leave the country. So migration is a big factor. But in terms of the number of doctors that Cuba has per thousand, I don't think there's a country in the world that has as many doctors as Cuba does.
And actually, speaking about Cuban doctors, and just to take a tangent off of the Pacemaker campaign, which again is an extraordinary victory, I think we owe a big round of applause to Global Health Partners for that. Um, let's talk about what's happening in the world community in terms of these doctors. There's this insanity taking place about looking at these men and women and folks that are leaving Cuba to go do these international brigades, to go to countries, developing nations that have little to no health care in rural areas, in poor working class areas, are being targeted and being, the T word. I'm going to be very careful here on YouTube not to use the T word, but they're being called T. They're inciting riot and inciting, fear. Tell us a little bit about that, Bob. What is the
Well,
perspective that you have on that?
sure. But before we jump to that, let me just mention that the Pacemaker campaign was one of the most collaborative campaigns in the United States in terms of the solidarity movement. It included national organizations like DSA, Code Pink, the International Longshoremen's Union. It included local solidarity groups, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Seattle, Massachusetts. So I want to emphasize the collaborative nature of these campaigns. It's not just Global Health Partners here in New York. It's a national effort that makes this work possible. To your question about the Cuban medical brigades, uh, Trump and Rubio decided when they first took office, and it's something that Rubio has banged away on for several years. Uh, the medical brigades have become a large source of Cuba's hard currency, to very blunt. It generates more money than travel and remittances these days. So Trump wants to cut off hard currency as much as they can. So they've targeted these international medical brigades, which truthfully are doing work that doctors in country either can't do or don't want to do. Whether it's going to Mexico, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Jamaica, the Bahamas, uh, Cuban doctors are in there in communities that local doctors, are not providing services. The United States has attacked them, and they've attacked the governments as well, basically saying you choose Washington or you choose Havana. And if you continue to have medical brigades in those countries, they've cut off visas for foreign leaders to come to the United States, families of foreign leaders. They've closed bank accounts. So it's a very targeted attempt to force those countries not to have Cuban healthcare professionals in their countries.
So it's the good old approach that the U.S. loves, which is isolation and criminalization. Because if you're having bilateral relations with Cuba, then that makes you the enemy. Very interesting, but I mean, they're also talking. There's been these ridiculous rumors about how those Cuban doctors are there and they're organizing and dealing with narco trafficking and sex trafficking and all of these ridiculous, outlandish statements. And it's all about isolation and criminalization. How do we fight that, Bob? What is it that we need to do to educate people? Because we're dealing with the most globally powerful media system in the world. How is it that we fight that?
Well, I'm not sure anybody is buying this, at least internationally. I don't think anybody is buying the rhetoric coming out of Washington. And to your point about the UN vote coming up, I think the UN vote is the 27th or 28th of October. I may be wrong by a day or so, but you'll see an overwhelming number of countries speaking out against the blockade and supporting an end to this insanity. Having said that, here in the belly of the beast, so to speak, we've got a much tougher job, and I think the administration has been successful in selling this lie. Uh, and that's a challenge that we're attempting to work at. And I think you see this collectively around the United States, webinars, events, speaking out about attempts to isolate Cuba, attempts to demonize the medical internationalism. The challenge here is much more difficult than the global challenge. Again, I don't think anybody is buying what Washington is selling about Cuban doctors. They look in a lot of these countries, they've seen the Cuban doctors, they've worked with Cuban doctors. If you remember going back to COVID, uh, the Cubans sent a delegation to Italy to provide services for Italians combating COVID. People know what the Cuban doctors provide. So I don't think it's a question of convincing the international community. The U.S. Population is a whole nother story.
Absolutely. If the New York Times or New York Post or any of these other larger media affiliates are writing about how these Cuban doctors are there fermenting criminalization, then you know how certain people are in the United States. If the New York Times says it and writes it in print, it's like it's been, chiseled into stone and brought down from from like one of the Ten Commandment tablets. So
Precisely, precisely. And you've got the Miami Herald banging away at this almost daily. It's a lie after lie after lie. But if you repeat it enough, people buy it.
absolutely, it becomes doctrine. It becomes exactly what, and I agree with you. I think it's that educating that needs to happen because again, the press that comes out internationally from human rights watches, from organizations all over the world that talk about, international philanthropy and international, just solidarity and aid, have written extraordinary articles about the Cuban doctors and the work that they have done in countries where you're right, where doctors either don't have the resources to do it or doctors flat out, especially in Latin America, will say, I'm not going to mountain areas. I'm not going to rural areas. I'm in the city. I'm not making that attempt. And you have Cuban doctors living in some of the most interesting, challenging places around the world, providing healthcare, giving vaccinations.
Yeah.
Bob, let's talk a little bit. I love it when we talk about this history because I think the medical field, the medical humanitarianism from Cuba is always so powerful. Let's talk a little bit about like Hurricane Katrina. Let's talk about the recent pandemic. What was Cuba's response worldwide around those things?
Well, you're covering a lot of ground there. But
Yeah, it is.
going back to Katrina 20 years ago, if you remember, the Cubans offered to send the Henry Reeves Medical Brigade to New Orleans, and they were literally sitting at the airport in Havana, waiting for a plane and waiting for an okay from the United States to ship hundreds of doctors to New Orleans to provide services. That invitation never came, and they ended up sitting and waiting for days at Havana Airport, and it was a missed opportunity. Um, but if you recall, the one of the tenets of the revolution, Cuba, healthcare is free, universal, as a matter of the constitutional law. Everybody has full access to healthcare services. Fidel Castro's medical internationalism was to send doctors out, as you said, Ben, to countries and to areas where doctors were not being available, where doctors were not serving. And Fidel's idea was to send doctors globally as a means of showing the humanity that Cuba had for the world. And they had a huge number of doctors in Africa, for example. They have a large number of doctors even today in Latin America, South America, at least in countries where the United States has not been able to uh, force the governments to uh, force the doctors out. Um, During COVID, I think Cuba was in, I'm not going to get the number of countries right, but it was somewhere in the area of 44, 48 countries providing services. And even more important than that, Ben, is that during COVID, if you recall, Cuba, for several reasons, Cuba invented two of their own vaccines. They did not participate in the Gavi program. They were not convinced that they would get a sufficient amount of vaccine at the time, and they were worried that Washington would block the distribution of vaccine to Cuba. So, in the midst of a pandemic where Cuba had no money coming in because they shut the country down, they invented two vaccines, which both have the same efficacy as Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. And their problem was they didn't have enough syringes, which is something that we addressed. And I think you and I talked about that the last time I was on this show. But Cuba was willing to give that vaccine to any country in the world that wanted it. And the trouble is, they never got end use authorization. And that was political. They registered the vaccine. I don't believe to this day that they've received authorization for the sale, the commercialization of that vaccine. So, back in the day, everybody was looking for vaccine. Today, I walk into a local drugstore or a local Dwayne Reed or CVS, and the first thing I'm asked at the prescription window, do you want a vaccine? This country is awash in vaccine. Uh, but Cuba stepped up, invented two vaccines, and offered it to Africa and the developing world at no cost.
Ah, thank you, Bob. Thank you so much. Bob, as we're closing out, I just wanted to ask, where can we get more information about the work that Global Health Partners does? And maybe is there anything written, like an update that folks could look at about what happened with the Pacemaker campaign? And if there's any steps, where do we go? Where do we read?
Sure. Global Health Partners has a website, ghpartners.org. It's on Instagram. It's on Facebook. We will have an update up within the next week or so. As I said, we've just closed the campaign. Uh, so ghpartners.org is probably the best place to go for information. There's also the Saving Lives campaign. People can go to uscubanormalization.org. They can go to savinglives.org. The National Network on Cuba, NNOC.org, puts up information about these campaigns.
All right. So, listening audience, one more time, we're going to have Bob uh, run by all of those resources one more time. Bob, tell us these websites one more time, please.
Well, the key one is ghpartners.org. That's GHPARTNERS.org. And then there's the National Network on Cuba, U.S. Cuba Normalization, and even Cuba C here in New York has a website. Uh, so any of those will have information about the Pacemaker campaign and any other campaigns that we're doing.
Familia, these are extraordinary resources, beautiful, well stocked, beautiful websites that have a lot of pertinent information. Just don't read about what happened with the Pacemakers campaign. Read about what's all the wonderful resolutions that are being passed all over the United States calling for an end to the blockade against Cuba. Read about some upcoming webinars that are coming up. They're great resources, and it's just, Bob, it is so wonderful to hear campaigns starting and ending in victory. I think in our work, oftentimes campaigns can be generational with and speaking as someone who fought, from the age of 19 to nearly 38 for the release of political prisoners, I know campaigns can be generational when they're as grassroots as we are, and the work that we do. So just to hear that nearly 800 pacemakers have been sent to Cuba, nearly 800 lives have been saved is so powerful. And as the son of a woman who has a pacemaker, who relies on her pacemaker to live, it is extraordinary to hear that nearly 800 people in Cuba are going to be given, a second license to live. That's extraordinary, Bob. I want to commend all of the forces involved. I love how Bob reminds us that this was a collective effort. Thank you so much to Global Health Partners, GUAC, all the forces, our comrades in Europe that also participated and supported this great thing. End us off, Bob. How do you want to end this podcast? Tell me.
Well, I thank your listeners for their support because I know you've been promoting this and you've been in this for the long haul. We are too. As I said, this is 31 years that we've been working with Cuba. We don't bounce from country to country, issue to issue. As you said, we're very focused, we're very targeted, and this is not the last campaign. As long as Cuba is under siege, as long as there's a blockade, we're going to be fighting as hard as we can to sustain Cuba's healthcare system. So thanks to you, thanks to your audience, uh, and we'll just keep struggling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Familia, Aceres, this has been your September edition of The Bronze Titan. Thank you to Bob for joining us, talking with us today, educating us, enlightening us, and just sharing this extraordinary victory. Thank you to the listening audience. We're going to do the YouTube commercial. If you like this podcast, please share it. Please subscribe to our channel. Turn on your notifications so you can always catch when we produce the next segment. Our next one should be in October, and it's going to be focused in on the United Nations and the vote that's taking place, yes, towards the end of the month. Como siempre, Cuba sí, bloqueo no.